committee minutes and reports, closing 12:30. I want to make a proposal that maybe we deal with adoption of committee minutes and reports, just maybe before we can even get the progress made in the restoration effort. That can only be possible if we do have the required quorum. Do we?
We have a quorum, however, I've got technical issues, so I can't fly.
All right, there's a, okay, all right, there's a request that we consider the adoption of committee minutes in the next meeting, which is next week. That's fine. It seems like we're going to have a very long meeting because of the tour of the building affected by the fire. As I welcome the Acting Secretary to Parliament, Advocate Pindela, I have already welcomed the Speaker. Maybe before, let me not hand over to the Acting Secretary of Parliament, but afford the Speaker an opportunity to lay the foundation. Then she will guide as to who is going to take us through the presentation. You're welcome, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good morning, honorable members. Chairperson, even before I make my introductory remarks, I would like to make an appeal to members without seeking to dictate to members how or what they should do or how they should be doing things. But I was just looking at the weather this morning. It is rainy, it is windy, and I would like to suggest that if members could agree that perhaps we do not do the tour of the building today, particularly because remember this part of the process will be to put up some kind of roofing, and now we don't have that as yet. The engineers are here. They can speak for themselves once I'm done with my introductory remarks, but I would honestly want to discourage members from going into the building today, just in case, because we don't want to be held liable for, unfortunate incidents or injuries which may occur. I'm just throwing it to members as I make my introductory remarks. Good morning, honorable members, chairpersons, Honorable Masondo. I haven't seen him here. I'm chairperson of the NCOP. I'm sure he will be joining me. Members of the management team of Parliament, and morning to all of you, to the team which is assisting us to restore Parliament. Once again, let me express our sincere gratitude for the opportunity you have given us to appear before you, especially as it relates to the important requirement to update both yourselves and all South Africans about the work of restoring the infrastructure of Parliament following the fire disaster. As you will remember, last year, during the introduction to the debate on the budget vote of Parliament, we made a clear undertaking to develop a practical roadmap for the restoration of parliamentary precinct and to also communicate the details thereof to the public through accountability mechanisms of Parliament, being this joint standing committee. We are pleased that since then, Parliament received a lot of support from both government and broader public, enabling us to sustain the business continuity of the institution and towards the actual rebuilding and restoration of the infrastructure that was compromised as a result of the fire. In this regard, I want to particularly acknowledge and thank the Minister of Finance, Honorable Kotongwane, for his active support together with his team led by the DG, acting DG, Mr. Momonat. I'm thanking them because they've really taken this process forward and in a very clearly committed way. They are determined to assist us. We have agreed that we will put together a tripartite team which will consist of us here, Secretary to Parliament, DG Finance, and DG DPWI. So that, to me, was a clear demonstration that they too realize the importance of rebuilding Parliament with speed to make sure that 2-3 years to come, we will have proper infrastructure. Now, in demonstrating that kind of support, as you know, they were keen in the engagements which we had with them to adjust the baseline to our allocation with additional resources, and we now talk about a 2 billion, which is 2 billion, which would be hopefully, the total amount required to rebuild Parliament. I also want to acknowledge the specific role played by the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure for everything they continue to do as the custodians of the state property infrastructure to ensure that we are able to get to the bottom of both causes of the devastation and implement a restoration program capable of correcting the deficiencies that resulted in this disaster. We also wish to express our eternal gratitude to the City of Cape Town for the support they've given us through the work of the fire department and the availability of the town hall, which has now become the extension of our infrastructure when we have big events such as the State of the Nation address and the budget votes. Lastly, let me also add a special gratitude and appreciation to all members of Parliament and support staff of the institution for bearing the brunt of the inconvenience and direct implications of this disaster on a daily basis. It is you who have the first-hand experience of the trauma that is resultant from the destruction of such a national heritage treasure. Honorable members, as you are aware, last year we welcomed the pronouncement by the Minister of Finance that there will be an additional budget allocation ring-fenced by National Treasury towards the restoration of Parliament Precinct following the fire. The Minister announced during the mid-term budget, you will recall, policy in October, that an overall allocation of 2 billion will be set aside for the restoration program, and that an initial allocation of 118 million was made during the medium-term policy statement. And that was ring-fenced for unforeseen and unavoidable expenditure as a result of the impact of both the fire and COVID-19 on the operations of Parliament. The allocation affords Parliament an opportunity to urgently deal with infrastructure challenges posed by the fire, which includes project planning for the rebuilding of damaged infrastructures, interim arrangement for physical return of all members to Parliament, resumption of physical sittings for plenary and committees, broadcast infrastructure, and modernization of committee rooms to enable hybrid meetings. As reported to the Chief Whips Forum a few days ago, a lot of progress is already made. It has been made towards the planning for the actual restoration, as well as for the interim arrangements to bring members and staff back to normalized operations of Parliament. This will be covered by the presentation that the management team will make to the joint committee today. Lastly, chairpersons and members, let us remember this, that the restoration of the Parliament precinct is not just about rebuilding a structure, but it is about restoring and reaffirming the centrality and functioning of our democracy. It is about ensuring that our duly elected public representatives have a safe and secure place to meet, debate, and make decisions that affect our lives and the integrity of our sovereignty. It is about preserving our history and our culture for generations to come. Honorable members, at this point, I will hand over to Advocate Pindela, who is the acting secretary this week, and Advocate Pindela will then introduce the rest of his delegation. I thank you, honorable members.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Over to you, and Advocate.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you, co-chairpersons of the committee. Honorable members, before I proceed, I would want to submit the apology of Secretary to Parliament, who is on leave. I would also want to submit the apology of Chairperson, National Council of Provinces, who is attending Pan-African Parliament. I am with members of the management team. I am also with colleagues from DBSA. I am also with Mr. Mashiro, who is going to make a presentation. Mr. Mashiro was employed to assist Parliament to manage this project because Parliament does not currently have the capacity to manage a project of this magnitude. Having said that, co-chairpersons, Madam Speaker, honorable members, I just want to make introductory remarks before I hand over to Mr. Mashiro to make a presentation. Members would be aware that DBSA has been appointed as the implementing agent for this project. For the purposes of implementation, DBSA will be responsible for this project. Presentations have been made insofar as the process that has been followed in appointing DBSA, as well as in the implementation of this project. Without any waste of time, we'll try as much as we possibly can, co-chairpersons, to summarize the presentation. The presentation itself consists of about 32 slides, but as I've indicated, we'll try as much as we possibly can to summarize the presentation. The presentation consists of two parts. The first part relates to the restoration of the banned buildings, the National Assembly Chamber, as well as the old Assembly Chamber, as well as the creation of offices for alternative accommodation for members. I'll then request, with your permission, chairpersons, Mr. Mashiro, to proceed with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Advocate. Good morning, honorable chairpersons, honorable speaker, and members of the committee. As the advocate mentioned, my name is Simon Mashiro. I'll just run through the presentation to give the highlights. It has been indicated that on the 6th of March, DBSA took handover of the project, and the project comprises different work packages, and those work packages largely are these in respect of members' offices. In respect of members' offices, restoration of the old assembly and the new assembly, the master plan for Parliament precinct, and the total facilities management. If I explain the scope in respect of this, obviously there are early work packages, meaning work that is going to be done immediately.
Chairperson, I don't understand. I think there seems to be a problem with the mic. I don't know if you can, if the speaker is audible.
Am I audible? Or okay. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Can I just go back slightly so that I put context in the work packages? So that is to provide accommodation for members in terms of offices and restoration of the buildings that were burned down and master plan for the Parliament precinct, including the total facilities management, which is a concept and not the operations itself. And linked to that, there are other sub-work packages that come as in early work packages. And then, of course, the restoration of the buildings is a long-term work package. So the short-term ones relating to safe access route, which is to determine the access to the buildings, which led to the verification of assets, and of course, scanning of the buildings and rubble removal. In the definition of the scope, just to understand context on what we're going to get out of that, the safe access route was designed specifically that we can find areas where we can enter in those buildings that were burned down and be able to verify assets for the purpose of the Auditor General reports. You'll note that those assets carry a value, and anything that you need to write off, there has to be justification for writing off. If you have to impair the assets, you need to justify that, and you can only do that by physical verification of those assets. So safe access route led to us being able to get the verifiers to get into those buildings. In relation to the rubble removal, it will allow us to conduct a further detailed analysis so that we can be able to decide on the options that we need to take. That if we have to demolish a structure, it should not just be to demolish because we think that the integrity is not tight. It has to be based on a thorough analysis and even scanning. Reconfiguration, obviously, is about providing office space for members, and also there's other allied services that are going to go with that. The medium-term to long-term work packages, the restoration of the old and the new assembly. I think the key issue that one has to mention is that apart from the repairs, there's also a requirement for upgrading the buildings so that they meet the national building regulations. Members will note that the old assembly, some of the corridors are too narrow, too dark, no lighting, no sufficient ventilation. And work will not only be about repairs, but rather to align that to national building regulations. And further to that, there's a need to take an opportunity of aligning the restoration work to the South African cultural themes so that our heritage becomes broader and not just linked to the old history of these buildings. The master plan is about redesigning the entire Parliament precinct to ensure that the functionality of the buildings is improved, to ensure that members can navigate easily and optimize spaces among the different buildings. And that is a concept, and the deliverable on that is going to be a design which members will engage in terms of their inputs, so that we can visualize what the future Parliament has to look like in terms of the members' strategic objectives and the functionality of the core business of Parliament. Total facilities management, again, is just to ensure that we have an optimal way of managing the assets of Parliament and ensuring that there's optimal maintenance and ensure continuity of the use of assets, and that the core business of Parliament is not affected. So when DBSA started, they presented a roadmap or milestones, and those milestones obviously are based on dates. And I need to qualify that there are certain areas where we are slightly delayed, and I'll give the reasons for why we were delayed in respective work packages. But the first work package was about determining the safe access routes so that we can be able to verify the assets, and that work package was concluded. The second work package was about the reconfiguration of the 4th and the 5th floor on 90 Plain Street, which obviously work has continued in terms of the planning, design, and construction is going to commence on the 18th, which I'll explain in the main body of the slides. The second one is about removal of rubble and debris in the buildings that were affected. And of course, designs have been put together. Planning work was done, designs were put together, and construction will commence shortly. The master plan is obviously another milestone, which is going to be delivered on the 23rd of March 2024. There will be various stakeholder consultations, so that it's not only DBSA that gives a concept or a design. without engaging with the stakeholders. And of course, the key deliverable will be to restore these buildings, and the key date for final handover would be the 10th of September 2025 in terms of the buildings that were affected by fire. So maybe just to give context before we now get into what are we going to build and how are we going to approach that, just to qualify that in terms of the Council for Built Environment, it's mandatory that you go through different stages. And in terms of inception, concept, and viability, concept and viability is the most critical stage that we need to spend the most time in. So 25% of our time in terms of planning has to go into concept and viability, because that's where we're going to make major decisions as to whether we demolish a certain section and conduct an economic analysis of that decision, conduct structural analysis or engineering analysis, and also social economic aspects, because stakeholders may also have interest in terms of heritage value of those sections. So considerations have to be made in terms of getting this right, and once you have it right, moving into other stages, obviously it would have been to firm up what you decided in terms of stage 2. So in terms of safe access route, I explained that we concluded that, so I will not say much, but what it actually did was to give us an understanding of where we need to go. So the dark area that you see on the middle of the screen, that's the center of the, that's the chamber, and that's an area where we cannot access completely because of health and safety risks. So the color coding on the report that was produced, essentially the green are areas where you can safely navigate, but still you need to navigate them with caution. The yellow, you can move around those areas. However, caution needs to be taken because there may be objects that may fall from ceilings, or you may trip based on minor objects. Orange is the fire damaged sections. And having gone through that type of environment, it means that some sections may fall and some structures may collapse, and it's not advisable that members walk through without the guidance of the engineer. The red zones are the no-go zones, which are terribly affected and have rubble and have structures that may fall and create secondary damages. So the report that we produced outlines all these areas, floor by floor, building by building, and I put these two just for an example to demonstrate what the safe access route indicated. So the red arrows that you see, or the arrows that you see running into the heat map, is just to show where you can actually navigate safely without having problems. So just to give you a context, and perhaps it may not even be necessary to go into the buildings if one wants to see what the situation is like. This is a typical example of a no-go area, and essentially one can see that there's absolutely no way that you can go in there. Even an engineer cannot go there, or even the people that are going to do the rubble removal will not go in this section, because you need to have special scaffolding to prop all these buildings, that if you remove anything, even if it's just a minor piece of metal, it may be connected to a structure, and as you pull it, a wall can collapse or a ceiling can collapse. So that's why it has to be managed with special care. This is one of the examples of the no-go area. You may just want to hang on to a piece of wood, and it may crumble and get the whole structure coming down. This is a typical example of an orange section, and I noticed that the color does not come out quite nicely on the screen, but this is orange from my from my slide. Okay. So from the orange, you'll notice that there are many obstructions that will cause tripping, or that you can knock your head as you walk around. You can still go in there. You must go in guided by the structural engineer. On the far right, I put a slide just to show that a corridor may look to be safe, but when you look on the surface of the wall, it may be infested with mold. And the mold is one of the problems in terms of whether, if you come into contact with the skin, it affects you, or the spores that actually come from the mold if they find way into your lungs, it's going to become a problem. But bigger than that, there's also bacterial growth in these areas because these areas are devoid of oxygen. And most of the bacteria release hydrogen sulfide. And hydrogen sulfide suppresses oxygen in the lungs, and it causes dizziness. It can cause other secondary diseases. So you may say that it's safe to go into the building. You may say, I'm wearing a mask because the spores cannot get into my lungs, but hydrogen sulfide released by the bacteria that grow into these areas can become a problem. So this is an example now of a yellow where you can walk around, but of course you can trip if you're not careful. I noticed that some areas are dark, and you may be talking to someone without seeing, and you can trip over and fall onto a nail or fall onto an object that is sharp that can pierce through your eye or whatever part of your body. This is a typical area that is safe to walk through. It's a green area. You can go through. These areas are not much affected. However, as I explained, oxygen levels are too low, so it is very important that you don't spend too much time in those buildings. So after we did that safe access routes and mapped them out, we managed to do asset verification. And these are the examples of assets that we found in these buildings, and just to indicate that there are assets that actually can still be utilized and in a good condition. And therefore, from the audit point of view, we're going to record these in their net book value as the carrying book value in the asset register. But then you have another situation where you have assets that came into contact with water, especially those that are sitting in the basement of the National Assembly. The data center, some assets were slightly affected by water, as in the water found way into the storeroom. And the key issue is about the moisture in the building, that it may have gone into some of the servers, so those will require to be tested. Much as we verified them from an audit point of view, but they still need to be tested, and IT is going to do that immediately after this meeting. So they're going to remove some of the servers and go and test them in their offices on the 5th floor, just to make sure that if we make a decision on a write-off, it will be based on functionality or operability of the asset and not just the visual inspection. So in this point, you have some of the heritage assets that need to be recovered and cleaned. Some of these assets are infested with mold and bacteria, so it's not safe to pull them out and utilize them as they are. So they will need to be treated. There has to be a special arrangement to pull them out. Some of the bulk of the assets are in a bad condition. They're just heritage furniture, antique furniture, and not necessarily heritage furniture. And some of the furniture cannot be restored because as you pull it, the furniture falls apart. So it needs special handling, and it needs to be written off in terms of the annual financial statements. An example of assets that have been burned down, for example, in the National Assembly, there were 2,800 assets in the asset register. So the AG may say that we need to see those assets and we need to see the value reported in the annual financial statements. But this is what you're going to find in terms of what you see on the bottom right. And therefore, those assets need to be written off. So that's why we had to go through this important exercise of verification, which followed what I explained as safe key access routes. I'll just run quickly. As I said, we completed the process 100%. There are no issues that we need to discuss, no risks. And the only thing that we need to do is to submit a report so that the CFO can prepare the annual financial statements or update the annual financial statement. So that report is going to be produced on the 16th of May. In relation to rubble removal, work has been done in terms of planning, and engineering specifications have been put together, and work is going to start on the 9th of June and completed on the 31st of June. As you saw the status of those buildings, rubble removal will not be just to remove loose items on the floor. It will also be to remove items that are actually hanging or that are still mounted onto the ceilings, so that once those have been removed, a fair conditional assessment of the structures can be made. So that process will conclude on the 31st of July. There's also work that has been carried out in terms of assessment of the columns in the old assembly, because there was a scare that the structure may collapse because those columns seem to be compromised. But it was just an ingress of water into the plaster. And the structural engineers confirmed that the columns are still safe, and work in terms of repair of those columns will only start on the 20th of June and be concluded on the 26th of June. In relation to temporary roof on the old assembly, that's only going to start on the 20th of June, and the engineers have put together a design to ensure that as you put the roof, because the walls actually are not stable, that you don't create secondary damages in terms of the gables or the load-bearing walls to collapse. So they had to go through a careful process of planning and design to ensure that the roof that you're going to install is not going to create a problem in the process of construction. And of course, I mentioned that after the AG may have gone to do the testing, as we concluded our asset verification, the next step would be the AG to test the samples of what we verified for completeness and correctness. After the AG completes that process, we will be in a safe position to remove those assets, essentially. And the process will be concluded on the 31st July. So just to indicate, when we say rubble removal, it's not just to remove loose items. These are some of the items that we're going to remove. Repairs to the columns. Repairs to the columns, these are the columns that I was referring to. Removal of assets, and we're going to store them off-site. And this is where we're going to put a temporary roof to ensure that we don't have further damage to the structures, the assets, and also that work can continue during the course of construction. So in relation to rubble removal, we're still on track in that work package. And in terms of the risks, as one pulls any item from those buildings, I indicated that there may be secondary damages. Of course, we note that we need to do the screening of the contractors that we're going to engage ahead of time so that that does not cause delays. But potentially that can be a problem. And in relation to work associated with this work package, we're going to do a 3D scanning of the building. And the 3D scanning will give us the overall impression of the structure of the building, and that information we're going to use to look at how we can reconfigure all these buildings to make sure that they comply with the national building regulations. It will also give us a way of modeling how we can even increase the seating arrangement in the National Assembly chamber. So it allows you to make different options on a design, so that when you design, it becomes easy to choose options, and you can also be able to avoid clashes in terms of engineering work, as in structural and mechanical. So you know where the ducts are going to run easily, and you can optimize for meeting the national building regulations, or if stakeholders want any change to be made, it's easy to be made from the 3D scanning outputs or the model that's going to come on there. On the 9th, we're going to award the rubble removal contract, and completion will be the 31st of July in terms of the work. So in relation now to the main business of the restoration of these two buildings, just to give context, I indicated that work runs through different stages, and we are 1 week behind in terms of looking ahead in respect of our program. But of course, DBSA promised that through the tender evaluation process, they will be able to catch up in terms of the time that we lost. The risks that we've identified in this work package is that the heritage groups may actually interdict some of the activities that we're going to engage in, especially on the old assembly. So I indicated that the bulk of the work in the old assembly will be to make the building comply with the national building regulations. So if you knock down a wall, or you remove a door, you remove a basin, or you remove, those are heritage assets. So for any decision that you make, when you try to optimize or reconfigure the space, national heritage has to be considered, or SARA has to be consulted, and they have to go through every stage that you go through, and that has to be built into the program in terms of how we're going to conduct the work. Structural integrity, I mentioned structural integrity, but I think one of the key stakeholders which we discussed with the advocate was the change in stakeholder interest. So noting that Parliament is going through elections next year, for any new stakeholder that comes in, or stakeholders that come into the committees, they may come with different interests, they may come with different strategic objectives, and as we conduct our final designs, it's likely that new stakeholders may come and say, well, we don't have an interest in the way you see things or your designs, and that may have a bearing. So that transition needs to be managed carefully in terms of stakeholder engagement. So in terms of the work, for us to start stage 1 of this work package, we're going to appoint consultants. When I say PSPs, it's professional service providers, and those will be appointed by the 13th of June. And for us to gain leverage in terms of, again, bringing forth the construction work, we're going to pre-qualify the contractors in the area. And the pre-qualification basically will be just about functionality, just to check the capability of the contractors while the engineers are working on the designs. So when we come to a point of now finalizing the designs and being ready to go out on tender, all the contractors will be assessed on price and triple BE. So that in itself will give us leverage in terms of time. So the picture that I painted was all the work that is actually going to happen in the buildings that had burnt down. So the safe access routes, the rubble removal, temporary roof, columns and all that. And now we come into what we need to provide for members as offices so that the business of Parliament can continue. The brief was that we must build 155 offices on floor 4 and 5 of 90 Plain Street. So in respect of the different stages, we went through the planning, we went through the different options analysis and viability. We prepared designs, we went out on tender, and today DBSA is going to award the contract to the most responsive bidder. And construction will commence on the 18th of June, and we're going to hand over, or rather reach practical completion. So construction is going to start on the 18th of May, and then practical completion will be on the 13th of June. It will be a fast-track project, and the contractor is going to be required to run on 3 shifts a day. So from a security point of view, we've already engaged with protection services to allow the contractor to work throughout the night so that we meet the objectives of the project. One of the things that we're going to produce at the end, obviously, would be the as-built drawings and manuals. So if I give an outlook on this work package, we are behind on this schedule because the original plan of DBSA was that they were going to deliver on the 6th of June, I think from the presentation that they made to the Joint Standing Committee when they were first introduced. However, the issue that came into the picture was about the options on heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. As members know that the building does not have adequate or functional HVAC system. So there was an option of going for refurbishment of the existing system, or there was an option of having split units that will only be dedicated to floor 4 and 5 and leave out the rest of the building. The idea was to try to meet the timelines, the tight timelines, but then the disadvantage of that option was that it is more expensive and it does not give you leverage in terms of covering the whole buildings. But of course, there was practicalities in terms of now the existing system that some of the spares are not readily available and they had long lead times. So all those options and analysis that had to be undertaken by the mechanical engineer created a delay in terms of our designs, and hence we are behind. But safe to say that a tender was issued and the contractor is going to be appointed today, and we are planning to deliver on the 18th of June, where obviously floors 4 and 5, 155 offices will be delivered to members. As I indicated, completion in June, and then of course there's a handover process that needs to be made. A handover process obviously is a formal process where snagging has been completed and that there's an official signed off process. And that's just noting on what we're going to deliver. This is a floor layout of what we're going to deliver to members. Essentially, maybe if I go into as you go out of the lift lobby, obviously you have to go up, and this will be a mini reception area to ensure that when visitors are coming to see members, they don't just go straight into their offices or they don't wait at the lobby. So this small area, we included that as a mini reception. We included a 16-seater boardroom on the 4th floor, and there's a pause area which has a kitchenette, and it also has loungers for members to be able to sit and engage if they want to engage accordingly. So essentially that's the key features that one has to, apart from the offices, these are the spaces that we've provided for. The offices along the Plain Street or facing Plain Street, those are bigger offices, and even the ones facing the Parliament precinct. The ones in the middle are smaller because obviously we're restricted by the space available in those 2 floors. So offices on the periphery, they will have a typical desk, a chair, visitors' chairs, and a side table and chairs for meetings if members want to have meetings. And the only difference on the offices in the middle, they have a desk, they have a visitor's chair, but they don't have a side table for meetings. And of course, the boardroom that we've provided for will ensure that we address those issues. So essentially, just to see the layout of different areas, this is the waiting area, that's the boardroom, and the typical pause area or the lobby with the kitchen, just to get a perspective. And on the 5th floor, we were limited by the fact that there's a data center situated there. And as members know that there's no redundant data center. We only have one data center because the one in the basement was affected by water during the firefighting period. And therefore, it means that we cannot remove the data center of the IT. So we had to work around the data center, and the only logical decision that was taken was to ensure that all IT-related work remains in this area, and therefore we had to put the interpretation booths in this area and the sign language studio in this area. And of course, all this area will belong to the IT, and the IT colleagues will not interfere with members. They will have their own kitchen, and members will also have their own kitchen accordingly. And this is a typical, it's just an artist impression. It's not the actual finishing schedule of the offices, but it's just to give a perspective of, we're going to have an L-shaped desk, 2 chairs, the condensers and the cabinets, and then a side table for meetings. Of course, there's a 16-seater boardroom, and the pause area that I explained has a kitchenette for members to be able to refresh and also to sit on the lounger that I explained. In terms of the furniture, for comparison purposes, this is what is currently on the 6th floor, and a decision was taken that we need to move a notch higher in terms of meeting the members' decorum, and therefore the desks that are provided are of wood finish and L-shaped desks, and that obviously fits into a standard that will be suffice for members. And in terms of chairs, we have more ergonomic chairs that are more comfortable, and of course, meeting chairs and visitors' chairs and a side table. And of course, one has to explain that because we had limitation in terms of space, so everything had to be considered in terms of what size furniture you put in, what is the arrangement on the floor plan, and the like. And in terms of costing, the construction cost after we received the most responsive bidder will be sitting at 55 million, and the furniture is at 10.2 million. Our original estimate was 15 million, and the most responsive bidder came at 10.2. And in respect of the program, we also have to hire temporary interpretation booths, and the total cost of the project is going to be 69.7 million, which will give us total solution for 4 and 5, and then to allow members to be able to continue with their business. In respect of the master plan, which is another key deliverable, this particular one is just to be about coming up with a design for an ideal precinct of Parliament. We are going to engage all these specialists, but key to note is that the idea and the outcome will be to optimize space utilization, improve functionality of buildings, ensure that security considerations are made in terms of Parliament being the national key point. Green building concepts are going to be brought into the design. And of course, to align to the transformation agenda of Parliament, the whole idea will be to bring transformative themes into the design, and stakeholder engagement will have to take place. In respect of the total facilities management, which is another work package, we looked at the transitional arrangements, because the idea was that we did not want DBSA to